The sky above the lonely moon was painted in faded colors of gray and pale violet, and deep within that silent world stood a small human outpost forgotten by most of the galaxy, where a single man named Eli lived alone tending to a fuel station that hadn't received a visitor in weeks, maybe even months. He had grown used to the silence, the rhythm of blinking lights and humming machines filling his days and nights while the rest of the universe carried on far away. Eli's life had become simple: wake up, check the systems, eat something from a sealed packet, fix what needed fixing, and sleep among the metal walls of the outpost. He had almost forgotten what it felt like to hear another voice that wasn't a machine or his own echo, bouncing off empty corridors. But that routine cracked open on the night the sky tore apart above him, and a strange sound filled the air like thunder and wind fighting in the sky. He rushed outside, pulling on his suit as alarms lit up on his console. A ship was crashing, not just passing by, but actually going down just beyond the ridge. He jumped onto his worn-out rover and sped across the rocky plain, the tires kicking up dust behind him, his heart beating louder than it had in a long time. When he reached the crash site, he saw the ship twisted and broken, half buried in the ground, glowing from beneath, its surface with colors no human technology used. And just as he hesitated, unsure if he should step closer, a hatch opened with a slow hiss. And from inside someone crawled out, not something monstrous, not a robot, not an insectoid nightmare from war stories, but someone that looked almost human. She collapsed as soon as she touched the ground, and Eli rushed forward, catching her before her head hit the rocks. Her skin shimmered faintly like moonlight, her hair floated slightly as if not fully obeying gravity, and her eyes, when they opened for just a second, were wide and bright and filled with fear and exhaustion. He carried her back to the station with care, placing her on the medical bed and letting the scanners do their work. Her vitals were weak but stable, and before he could ask who she was or where she came from, she whispered something in a voice soft and strange, but clear enough to understand. She said her name was Kayla, and that she was the last of her kind, and she had come seeking one thing, only one last hope hiding among the stars, and somehow she had found him. Eli stared at her, trying to understand the meaning behind her words, and she reached for his hand with trembling fingers and said he was the only one who could help her, that she had scanned hundreds of systems and millions of life forms, and all the data led to one single match: him, a human, living alone on a forgotten moon. He didn't know what to say, his mind racing with questions, doubts, and fear. But as she held his hand tighter, her voice cracked with emotion, and she told him that her people were gone, wiped out by a war they could not win. Their world shattered, their bodies unable to survive more than a few generations without help, and she was the only one left. Now she had found a genetic match, someone whose distant blood carried the key to rebuilding what had been lost. And without him, her species would disappear forever. Eli sat beside her, unable to speak, as her eyes slowly closed again. Her body exhausted, her breathing shallow, and in that quiet moment, surrounded by the soft hum of machines and blinking lights, he realized that something far bigger than himself had just landed in his life, and nothing would ever be the same again. Eli could not sleep that night as he kept pacing around the station, his mind lost in thoughts too heavy for one man to carry. He had lived so many months in silence that even the smallest sound now echoed like thunder through the halls. But tonight it wasn't the hum of machines that disturbed him, was the memory of her voice, soft and broken, asking for something he never imagined he would be asked. Kayla remained unconscious on the medical bed, her body fragile, her breathing uneven, but the machines kept her stable, and Eli kept checking the screens, hoping for something to change, hoping for answers that would help him understand what kind of decision was being placed upon him. When she woke again the next morning, her eyes searched for him, and when she saw him standing nearby, her lips curved into the smallest smile, as if simply seeing another person alive gave her strength. He sat beside her, quietly waiting, and when she began to speak, her words were careful but steady, filled with a weight that made him sit straighter and listen without interruption. She told him of her people, once proud and bright souls of science and song, who had lived far from human space, their world green with silver trees and blue Rivers and skies filled with glowing clouds. They had watched stars rise and fall, and had believed for a long time that they were safe, untouched by the hunger of the galaxy. But safety had proven to be an illusion. Their enemies had not come in ships or armor, they had come in silence. Machines without minds, without faces, wiping out cities and memories as if they were cleaning dust from glass. Her people had no weapons strong enough to fight, and in the end, they had scattered, fleeing in all directions, with the hope that some part of their culture would survive. Kayla had been born on one of those ships, raised among the last scientists and historians who tried to protect their knowledge, but even they began to fade. Sickness spread through their bodies as the old genetic patterns began to break down. Something ancient buried in their code had begun to fail, and no medicine could stop it. Their last hope came from old stories, stories of the early ones, the first travelers who had wandered beyond the stars and shared their essence with other species. Among them were humans, and so began a search across the stars for someone who might still carry a piece of what they had once been. She had spent years following signals, crossing vast distances, chasing myths through empty systems, until her ship finally detected something strange, a signal from this lonely moon, a place where a human lived in isolation, far from home, and his blood carried the echo she needed, the last match left in the universe. Sat in silence as she spoke, his heart heavy with each word. He tried to imagine what it must have felt like to carry such a mission with the weight of an entire race on her shoulders, and to arrive broken and tired only to find a man who had long stopped believing anything beyond the walls of his station. He asked her if there was no other way, and she shook her head gently, explaining that her people had tried cloning and artificial blending and other complex sciences, but nothing had worked. Their bodies were built on connection, on shared essence, and only a living match could bring balance to what remained. Keela told him she did not ask for love or romance. She did not even know if her body could carry those things anymore. What she asked for was help, not for herself, but for the ones who had died with hope in their eyes, and for the memories that now lived only inside her mind. She begged him, not as a woman, but as the last daughter of a world now gone. Eli looked at her and saw not just an alien, but someone who had lost everything and still chose to keep moving forward, someone who had come through fire and darkness just to find one last door that might open. And as much as his heart resisted, as much as fear whispered in his ears, he could not turn away, not without understanding more, not without seeing what might be saved if he chose to believe her story. He stood up and walked toward the shipwreck outside, and for the first time in many years, he looked up at the stars, not as cold, distant lights, but as places where something greater might still exist, something that asked him to rise above his own silence and become part of something far beyond himself. Inside the station, Kayla closed her eyes again, resting her body while her mind whispered silent prayers to stars that maybe, just maybe, her journey had not been in vain. The days that followed moved slowly, like dust floating in sunlight, silent and steady, yet filled with things that could not be ignored. Eli found himself thinking about Kayla more than he wanted to admit. He brought her food, learned how to operate the medical system she had connected to his own equipment, and every time he entered the room and saw her eyes open with a quiet calmness, he felt a strange sense of responsibility, one that went far beyond duty. Kayla no longer looked as weak as before, but her strength was not fully returned. Her body was healing, but time was still slipping like water through fingers. She spoke more now, telling stories of her people, of their ways of living, how they had shaped art from sound and told history through light and rhythm, how they believed that every living being carried a melody that connected them to the stars. Eli listened without interrupting, as if her voice itself was some ancient music lost to time, and every word she spoke built a picture of a world he had never seen yet, could somehow feel deep inside, like the memory of a dream he had never lived. She showed him small crystals, glowing softly when touched, and explained that they stored the memories of her ancestors, memories now locked away unless passed to a new generation. He held one in his hand, and as it lit up with color, he saw fragments of cities, made of glass and forests that shimmered under twin moons and children playing. Under skies filled with floating gardens, as each day passed Kayla became more open, and Eli saw not just the mission behind her journey, but the person inside her, someone shaped by loss and hope, someone tired yet still, reaching forward with fragile hands towards something that might save all that once was. One evening, under the artificial sky dome, Kayla spoke more directly. She told him her time was running short. Her body was beginning to reject its own systems the longer she remained without connection. The faster the decay, she explained again, that only a living genetic match could create a stable, new seed that could carry her species forward. Eli stared at her, unsure, afraid, not because of the act she was asking, but because of the meaning behind it. It was not simply a matter of science or biology. It was the birth of something sacred, something that carried history within its very code, and now that burden had been placed on him. A man who had lived alone with no purpose beyond repairing machines and watching sunsets through dusty glass. She said she would never force him, that his will mattered more than the mission, because her people had believed in choice. They had believed in unity, not control, and though her voice trembled, her eyes held nothing but quiet respect for the decision only he could make. Eli stood for a long moment after she fell silent, feeling the silence stretch around him like a wave. He walked to the edge of the dome and looked out at the horizon, thinking of Earth, thinking of the cities he had left behind, thinking of the life he had once dreamed of, and the loneliness that had crept in when nothing went as planned. Then he turned back and saw her there, not as an alien, not as a stranger, not even as the last of her kind, but as someone who had trusted him with something far more precious than life itself. And in that moment, something shifted within him, a weight lifting, not because the burden was gone, but because he had chosen to carry. I've told her yes, not with loud words, not with dramatic gestures, but with a steady voice and eyes that no longer looked away. He said if there was a chance to save what she had lost, then he would help, not for glory, not for reward, but because no one else could. And if he walked away now, her story, and all those that lived within her, would vanish like breath in cold air. Kayla did not cry, but her eyes shone with a light that filled the room, and for the first time she reached out, not to ask, not to plead, but to hold his hand with quiet strength, as two paths became one, and the future of a forgotten world found a new heartbeat, waiting in the silence of a lonely moon. That night, preparations began with careful steps, with machines old and new working together, with two lives joined by purpose and not desire, with respect and not need. And as the stars moved slowly above them, the station that once felt like a cage now became a cradle for something far greater than either of them had ever imagined. The silence inside the station had changed. Now it was no longer heavy with loneliness, but filled with quiet purpose, the kind that settled over the skin like a warm blanket. Eli moved through the halls with slow, careful steps, checking each system, reading every signal, listening to every whisper of sound that came from the integration of Kayla's organic technology with his own machines. He was not a doctor, not a scientist. Kayla had taught him enough to understand the process. Her ship's core had survived the crash, though it was damaged and unstable, but it still held the knowledge of her ancestors and the advanced tools needed for the procedure they were preparing, not just a union of biology, but a bond of essence that would carry the spirit of her people forward in a single seed. It was delicate, more like planting hope than creating life. Kayla sat in the central chamber, resting her hands on the smooth, glowing console. Her body was thinner, now her face paler, and her eyes dimmer, but her voice remained steady, and her words still held the strength of someone who had lived through the end of a world. She explained how the process would begin, how his genetic imprint would be merged into her molecular structure through an interface far beyond human technology. It would not hurt him at first, but it would take something from him, a part of his energy, his life, his essence. Eli understood the price, though she never said it directly. He knew that something inside him would change forever if he went through with this, and he had already made peace with that. He had not known her long, but in her presence, He had found something he had thought was lost, a reason to matter, a chance to leave behind more than rusted metal and fading memories. The machines prepared the chamber, soft lights glowing along the curved walls, smooth cables rising from the floor like roots waiting for the connection. Eli stepped into the center, the cool air wrapping around him, and Kayla stood across from him, her hands reaching out, not in fear, but in trust. The interface began humming like a song just beneath the skin. As the process started, their bodies remained still, but something deeper began to stir. Colors flickered across the room, streams of light moving between them, filled with symbols, memories, knowledge, and emotion. Kayla's breath caught in her throat, and Eli felt a sudden wave of warmth and pressure, not pain but something deeper, like pieces of him being gently unthreaded from within. The machines worked without pause, syncing their rhythms, reading their patterns, and slowly weaving the first threads of the new seed. But then something shifted. The chamber lights blinked, warning signals flared, and Kayla gasped, her body trembling as her systems began to reject the process. Her condition had worsened faster than expected, and now the merging was causing a breakdown within her. The AI systems began to suggest options, and Eli quickly scanned through them. He saw one possibility: a deep transfer that would stabilize her, allow the seed to complete, and give her body enough strength to recover. But it came with a cost. It would draw heavily from him, not just energy, but years from his life force. It would age him rapidly and leave his body weaker than before. He did not pause. He did not hesitate, not even for a breath. He gave the command and closed his eyes as the transfer began, his body shaking as strength flowed out of him into her like a river pulled by gravity. His bones ached, his chest tightened, his vision blurred, and his heartbeat slowed, but he held on, focusing on her face, on the light in her eyes. As it began to return, Kayla cried out as her body responded, the collapse stopping, the balance returning, and the new life forming between them. A tiny spark within the system, now stable, now alive, and Eli smiled through the pain, knowing that the seed had taken root, knowing that her people would not vanish into dust. The process ended, and the lights dimmed. The silence that followed was soft like the quiet after rain, and Kayla fell to her knees, breathing heavily, her hands on the floor, her eyes filled with tears of something beyond sorrow and joy, something sacred and eternal. Lily sat slumped against the chamber wall, his hair now streaked with gray, his hands trembling, his breath shallow but steady. He looked at her and smiled again, not with pride, but with peace, knowing he had done what only he could do. She crawled toward him, her hands shaking as she took his in hers and held it to her chest. And in that moment, they were no longer two lives from different worlds, but one shared story, written in silence and sacrifice, and something that could never be erased. And in the chamber between them, glowing faintly with soft light, the new life waited, untouched by war, unburdened by the past, and filled with the promise of a future. Born not just from survival, but from choice, courage, and connection. Time moved gently in. The days that followed the station no longer felt cold or forgotten. It now held something quiet and sacred, a seed of life. Carried in light and silence, Kayla walked slowly through the halls, her body no longer shaking, her steps steadier with each passing hour. Though her strength was still fragile and her wounds not fully healed, she carried a glow beneath her skin, a soft warmth that pulsed gently at her core, where the new life was growing safely inside the chamber, connected to both their essences. Eli spent most of his time near the viewing deck, his body no longer strong like before, his hair now silver, his back slightly curved, and his hands showing the trembling of age, but his eyes remained steady, always watching the stars, as if looking for a sign, not from Earth, not from the world he had left behind, but from something deeper, something written in the stars. Since long before he was born, he never asked for thanks, and Kayla never gave him just words. Instead, she stayed beside him in the quiet hours, sometimes sharing memories, sometimes sitting in silence, sometimes placing a hand on his shoulder just to remind him that he was not alone and would never be. Again, the bond they had formed was not built on romance or desire, but on something more powerful, something born from sacrifice and trust. The seed chamber pulsed with life, its soft light growing stronger each day. It contained the code of her people, the memories of their world, and the connection to Eli's human line. It was not just a child, it was a future carrying the weight of what was lost and the hope of what could come. The machines cared for it with precision, ensuring its growth, while Kayla spent each moment passing her culture into it through voice, through touch, through memory crystals, placed one by one into the systemone. Evening, the sky above the station turned a deep shade of violet as the moon rotated slowly, bringing a rare view of a distant nebula. Kayla brought Eli to the observatory. Wrapped in a thermal blanket, his breathing slow but peaceful, and they watched the stars together. She told him that when the child was ready, she would leave this moon and find a place to begin again, a quiet planet far from war and machines, a place where the roots of her people could grow once more. Eli nodded, knowing his part in the story was nearly complete. His body had given what it could, but his spirit remained whole, filled with a quiet pride he never thought he would feel again. He had not saved the universe, he had not fought in grand battles or led mighty armies, but he had saved something irreplaceable, and he had done it by choosing to care when it would have been easier to look away. Kayla leaned her head gently against his shoulder, her eyes closed, and for a long time they stayed like that, two lives joined by fate beneath a sky that stretched forever. When the day came for her to leave, the station was quiet. Once more she prepared the small vessel, repaired and ready to carry her and the child across the stars. She had placed everything she could inside: maps, memories, tools, and all that remained of her culture. And Eli watched from the airlock, his body too weak to move much, but his mind sharp as ever. She turned to him before stepping aboard, and in her hand she held a crystal glowing with a soft silver light. She placed it gently in his palm and told him it carried her final memory, the one of him, the one that would be shared with every child of her kind, so that his name and his gift would never be forgotten. Eli smiled as she stepped onto the ship, the doors closing behind her, and as the engines came to life with a soft hum, the vessel lifted into the sky, rising slowly above the rocky ground and into the open silence of space, leaving behind the station, the moon, and the man who had chosen to give everything for a future he would never see. He returned to his chair beneath the dome, breathing in the soft filtered air, watching the stars with calm eyes, and though his body was fading, his spirit was brighter than ever, and far across the stars on a journey just beginning, a child grew, carrying the voice of two worlds, the dreams of a people long lost, and the courage of a human who once chose to answer a heartbreaking request, not with fear, but with hope, not with hesitation, but with the quiet strength to say yes when no one else could. The galaxy would remember him not through monuments or songs, but through the lives he helped save, and the stories whispered among the stars, where every light became a promise that even in silence, even in loneliness, one human heart could still change the fate of an entire world. The end.